This series celebrates the 10th anniversary of the Museum Studies program at the University of Michigan by showcasing Michigan faculty and leading regional museum professionals in conversations that straddle disciplinary boundaries dealing with a range of compelling issues. This afternoon, it is indeed my great pleasure to introduce to you Jeffrey Abt and Deborah Dash Moore. When it moved to its present location on Fifth Avenue in 1947, the Jewish Museum of New York began building a permanent cultural presence, within decades becoming known for its avant-garde art exhibitions that made the museum the place for New York's art world denizens to see the freshest and most adventuresome art. These avant-garde exhibits provoked debates within the New York Jewish community about the purposes of the Jewish Museum, which in turn raised difficult questions about the nature of Jewish identity in post-war America. Why did mid-century American Jews feel a particular affinity for avant-garde art? Why did they choose to express that affinity through the Jewish Museum? And why did the Jewish Museum's avant-garde art exhibition program end in the late 1970s? Today's conversation will consider these fascinating and far-reaching questions. For now, please help me in welcoming Jeffrey Abt and Deborah Dash Moore to the University of Michigan.
I'll begin by adding a little bit of additional information to help set the context of our conversation today. The Jewish Theological Seminary, which is located on the Upper West Side of New York, was founded around the turn of the century. In some respects as a reaction against the development of the Reform Jewish movement in America. Public opinion leaders who were interested in creating a seminary, a training school for rabbis that would strike a kind of middle ground between Orthodox Judaism and the Reform Jewish movement in America. The creation of the museum was actually kind of incidental in the rush to get the seminary going and to establish a library. Donors who were contributing books began to contribute some objects as well, and the objects were displayed in some table cases. It really wasn't until 1931 that the museum has its own room within the building of the seminary, again, still on the Upper West Side of New York. And at that point, it was called the Museum of Ceremonial and sometimes Objects, or sometimes the Museum of Ceremonial and Historical Objects. Clearly, the emphasis was on the notion of a museum as a kind of cultural resource, and perhaps also as a kind of teaching collection for the rabbis, that they could see various kinds of ceremonial objects as they might be used, as they might relate to the texts that they were studying, and so forth, but very much part of this rabbinic training program. It really isn't until Frida Warburg, who was the daughter of Jacob Schiff, a member of the Our Crowd generation, if you know this group of people in New York history, who decides to give the family mansion to the seminary to create a museum. And when this happens in 1944, the whole climate of opinion within the seminary about what role the museum might play changes. And the mansion, which is on Fifth Avenue on the Upper East Side of New York, is close to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other museums that existed in the area. And the rabbinic and lay leaders of the seminary saw this as an opportunity to create a public institution that would function like a museum. And as the chancellor of the seminary at that point said, really an opportunity to create the Museum of New York, even though it would be ostensibly a Jewish museum. It wasn't until 1957, about 10 years after the museum opened, that we begin to see the first of what I'm referring to here, we're talking about as these avant-garde exhibitions. And what we mean by these avant-garde exhibitions is that the art is not just abstract, but in some instances absolutely non-representational. So we're looking at work by some of the most rigorous, both abstract expressionist artists and then post-painterly abstraction, artists who are engaged in post-painterly abstraction. And I'll mention a couple of names. They might mean something to you, perhaps not.
And also that these are by artists who aren't necessarily Jewish at all.
Yes. So the Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko would be examples of artists who were Jewish, but in short order, the museum gave exhibitions to Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, the first really major solo retrospective exhibitions for both artists. Neither of them are Jewish. And a couple of years later, the museum hosts the first exhibition of minimalist sculpture in New York. And this is work as sculpture that is really deliberately, in terms of the way the artists create the work, designed to be non-representative and even non-evocative in a way. And that's what brings us up. And then there's the nature of the Jewish community itself.
So the question that we wanted to start with is, why does this happen in the middle of the 20th century? And what Jeffrey just told you, I think, should accentuate some questions in your mind. What is a largely rabbinical training institution, or teacher training institution it has as well, doing not just with a Jewish museum, which we might understand, but with a museum that is exhibiting, you know, the most cutting-edge art. Abstract, not necessarily by Jewish artists in the mid-century. And the other piece, I think, of the story that maybe will help us to start to answer this question has to do with what New York City was like at that time. Because New York was a city in the late 40s, which is when this the mid-40s, late 40s, when the gift is given, was a city that was among the most prosperous cities in the United States. Its population earned on average 14% more income than the rest of the United States. It was a city filled with Jews. Jews were the largest single ethnic group. Probably close to 2 million Jews lived in the city at that time. And the prosperity of the city in the post-war years gives all of its members, including Jews, disposable income. And so one of the things that begins to happen is that Jews are ready to buy art. And in thinking about this question, I put forth the notion that I think Jews were particularly interested in buying the art of living artists. They were less interested in collecting art of artists who were dead. They wanted to get involved in the art world itself. And the best way to do that was to be engaged with living artists. A number of Jews had set up galleries around town where the works were sold. Mm-hmm. And then you have to add into this mix the fact that Jews could not participate on the boards of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or on the boards of the Modern Museum for the most part, or even the Whitney. So there was this element of where were the opportunities to try to make a statement and to get engaged in this artistic cultural world. And the Jewish Museum provided one of those really important venues.
You know, one of the questions that I have when I think about, well, my sense of how museums, in a sense, become centers for controversy is that they provide a forum or a way for the public to become aware of debates that are ongoing in society already. And there was already in New York a very lively culture of criticism and debate about the nature of Jewish life, Jewish art and letters, and we think of critics like Clement Greenberg, Harold Rosenberg, Leo Steinberg, who are already writing, and in the case of Clement Greenberg, probably done most of their most important writing by about this time. But that debate seems to somehow be below the radar. And I'm kind of curious about why that is. Well, first of all, I'm curious about to what extent that penetrated the consciousness of the larger Jewish community, or whether they were sort of operating in their own little world of intellectuals who were debating ideas with each other, and maybe among the artists. You know, how did these ideas penetrate that larger Jewish community, or did they not?
Oh, I think, look, right after the war, you get the establishment of Commentary magazine, which is one of the places where Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg also write. And Commentary is a forum for New York Jewish intellectuals, but it is sponsored by the American Jewish Committee, which is a fairly also established around the same time as the Jewish Theological Seminary, but with a goal of protecting Jewish rights. So you might say, so what is this organization that has a goal of protecting Jewish rights doing, entering the realm of culture and producing a magazine that is debating ideas, political ideas, cultural ideas, sort of part of the new ferment of ideas. And I think that these ideas definitely engage Jews, not just they don't just stay on the periphery. There is a real sense that New York has become the center of Jewish culture worldwide. And that is, of course, in part because of the destruction of European centers of culture during World War II and the Holocaust. So New York's prominence and the opportunities for Jews within the city come to coincide. I would add also that I think that the Jewish Theological Seminary, especially under Louis Finkelstein, who was the new young chancellor at the time and someone who wanted to make the seminary an important participant in American culture. I mean, when he has his picture on the cover of Time magazine, you know, this is what he wants. He's reaching the audience he has in mind. Finkelstein saw Judaism not just in very narrow terms, not just as a religious movement, but as a part of a culture with many different elements. And so having a museum was an important statement, it seemed to me.
Oh, it coincides. Interestingly, when at the very moment, and in fact, I think it may be even in the very same letter that Finkelstein proposes to Frieda Schiff Warburg that she give her mansion to become this museum, he's also discussing his ideas for a radio program, which becomes The Eternal Light. And he single-handedly turned the seminary towards this notion of outreach and, in some ways, explaining Jews to America using the medium of radio and later on TV to get that message out. And so, yes, I think he did think of the museum, at least in the beginning, he thought of it as serving that role.
So a question I have for you, though, is what brought so many of these abstract artists within the orbit of the Jewish Museum? I mean, why, you know, is it just because the museum said we'll give you a show that they said yes? I mean, did they have feelings of ambivalence or whatever, that their show was going to be in the Jewish museum with the emphasis on the Jewish rather than museum piece of it?
That's a good question. I think in some ways that's what brought me to your work and to trying to understand the nature of the Jewish community at that time. Because we have a lot of different things going on, it seems to me, certainly within the New York Jewish community. We were talking before about how 1964 is when Fiddler on the Roof is premiered. We see a kind of movement towards what one scholar refers to as cultural revivalism that's going on at the same time that we see a real desire among a group of intellectuals and scholars and critics and collectors to embrace a kind of art form that seems to be all about renunciation. So we have these sort of dual activities of revivalism on the one hand and renunciation, at least in visual terms, on the other, that seem to be in direct conflict with each other. The Jewish Museum itself was not, it seems in the beginning, thought to be an art museum. But because of the fact that it was a place where stuff could be shown, and I think the opportunity to expand it and create more of a space, there was a desire to present things, and the question is, what do we show? And it began right with its opening in 1947 with a show of contemporary Jewish artists, but the work that was shown was what I think we would probably think of today as mostly sentimental art that was of a kind of nostalgic quality, art that maybe depicted biblical themes and so forth, scenes from the ghetto. You can imagine the kinds of imagery that one might have in these sorts of shows. So it really isn't until 1957 that we have this 10th anniversary exhibition, which interestingly is organized by Maya Shapiro, who was a scholar at your alma mater at Columbia University. And the catalog essay was written by Leo Steinberg, another prominent intellectual and scholar in New York. And it's telling, and maybe this is a clue, although I don't know. Steinberg talks about the art in the exhibition. It's mostly abstract art. And he concludes it by saying that it may be appropriate for the Jewish Museum to be presenting this abstract art because he says, after all, and I'm almost quoting him, he says, the Jewish people are an abstract nation. And I've tried to run down that notion of the Jews as an abstract nation. It comes up as early possibly in Sartre, although it's not entirely clear that's what he meant. Certainly there's a collection of essays that's published in 1946 by Ahad Ha'am, in which he does talk about the Jews as an abstract nation more specifically. There was clearly something in the air, but it's hard to put one's arms around what it was precisely. I'm interested in your observation about that collectors would have been interested in living artists. Why do you think that is? Why would that have been?
I think that collectors were not interested in buying their way into an old heritage, which what you can do when you collect older forms of art, right? The collections are you're developing a relationship with an old part of European culture, and that these American Jews were connecting in many ways with American artists. The center of the art world was now in New York, and I think they saw their collecting efforts as also ways of helping artists. That there was a kind of, even though we think of fine art as elite, when you start collecting living artists, it's not so elite yet, right? So there's a sort of democratic element to these collections, and I think they found the artists interesting people. They wanted to meet them and to mix with them. You see actually Jewish involvement with contemporary art in a whole bunch of other places. I mean, in Los Angeles, in Miami. I was just looking at the newspaper, the Times today, and there was this oh gosh, what's it called? A kind of performance art thing at the Contemporary Art Museum in Mocha with
Marina
Abramovich.
Yeah, Marina. That's right, Marina Abramovich. I mean, you know, this is the latest cutting edge kind of stuff, and it's done within an audience that it's not, where there are many Jews involved, and certainly Jews have been crucial, Eli Broad, especially for supporting that museum. So I think that it's not just New York, but New York is the first place that it becomes really visible, this connection. It's more fun to meet the artists than it is just to have a painting of somebody who's, maybe it's great, but the person's dead, right?
Mm-hmm. There were collectors, I mean, there were in the immediately previous generation collectors who were collecting older art. And in fact, Frida Warburg's husband, Felix Warburg, was a great collector of old master prints, many of which ended up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And he had a good friend who ended up being curator there. And so there's this switch. Something happens. And perhaps it's because they don't feel they can gain entree through that kind of collecting. I don't know. But I still wonder about that affinity for that kind of work, because it's not work that really you would think would necessarily appeal to people at this particular moment.
I think you'd have to take a different kind of lineage, you know, to go back, let's say, to Stieglitz and some of the what was very contemporary art that he was showing at the beginning of the 20th century, trying to see this art also as very American. And I see these exhibits as ways of Jews making statements about the importance of American art. In addition, that this was not European, not to mention the fact that it also wasn't old, but it was American. And I know that there have been scholars who've sort of critiqued this as a part of a Cold War kind of thing, but which I don't see it as so much. But I do see the American dimension as important for it.
There was, at one point, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm working on a book on the Jewish Museum, which has something to do with this conversation. And at one point, I was looking at the minutes of a meeting in which there was a pretty heated debate about why the museum should continue to preserve, to pursue that program. And the question became, it turned into a question about the mission of the museum. And the mission of the museum is preserving and presenting the Jewish community and a sense of Jewish identity. I don't think those were the words that they used. And one of the prominent collectors who was participating in that debate said, essentially, well, I'm Jewish and this art speaks to me, and therefore this is a legitimate subject for the Jewish Museum to pursue. So that sense of identification with that art was pretty visceral and pretty deep. Not, at least in the case of this one person, easy to articulate.
I think one has to think about the social worlds of art and not just individuals. And the New York had a number of interesting overlapping social art worlds that existed at the time that nourished artists, some Jewish artists, some non-Jewish artists, but nourished them in ways that allowed for exchange of ideas and a willingness to look at each other's work and to discuss that work. And some of the collectors get drawn into these social worlds, and in a sense, their tastes get educated through the social worlds of the art worlds that existed at the time. I know from the work that I've done on photographers in New York, again, many of whom were Jewish, that there were these social worlds. I mean, for photographers, they were also pretty much left-wing, and I don't know that that's necessarily the case here with the artists, but I would say that they are very much rooted in the experience of the city itself.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think it's very true that there was an art world. And the denizens of that art world consisted of collectors and dealers and artists and critics, and that they were clearly speaking with each other. It's not clear to me how much overlap there was with, let's say, that world of opinion leaders in the Jewish community in terms of leaders of the Jewish community. There must have been some overlap, clearly, because that would have made these sorts of intersections possible. But I wonder to what extent there was also a kind of urban and suburban tension developing as well, because as the Jewish community in New York begins to move away from the city center and is moving out to Long Island or New Jersey or wherever they're going, and they're taking institutions with them and they're building new synagogues and community centers and so forth, that part of the tension that arises and people begin to react against the avant-garde exhibition program, rabbis from suburban temples and so forth. And part of that is a disaggregation going on within the Jewish community in terms of a kind of centered sense of what is vital culture, what vital Jewish culture at that moment, meaning the 1960s, early 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of ironic because in the movements out to the suburbs, and you look at some of the art that gets commissioned by synagogues and stuff, some of it's very abstract. It's not quite as minimalist, let's say, as the sculpture, but it is abstract, and the abstraction is seen as expressive of Jewish spirituality, among other things. But yes, suburbanization reduces the density of New York Jewish life and brings into play other forms of taste and interest. And I think that among the reasons why the museum probably begins to depart from this program is the fact that it doesn't have quite as intense a Jewish community as it had before. I would say that the other thing that happens in the late 60s and 70s is the rise of feminist art and much more politicized art that's connected with ethnic identity. And that leads to demands in part by Jewish artists who see themselves as Jewish artists to want to have a museum as a place where their work can be shown, right? They have things to say Jewishly through their art, and they want venues for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of a shift that's going on at this time.
Hard to say. I've thought about that a little bit because
yeah.
we've discussed that a little bit before. There is, I think that among the community of Jewish artists who choose to allow themselves to be identified as Jewish to some extent or another, there was a kind of love-hate relationship with the idea of exhibiting with the Jewish Museum. On the one hand, there were some who didn't really want to be identified in Jewish in that sense and didn't want to be identified with the museum. And Ben Shahn, interestingly, was an artist who specifically disavowed any desire to be identified as a Jewish artist. He wanted to be identified as a contemporary American artist. And
Although
really,
he does work for synagogues.
yes,
Yeah, okay.
right. No, I mean,
Including southern ones where he shows, explicitly, I mean, his work is more representational, but explicitly, interracial murals and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think there's probably a change also in terms of just the discussion. I guess there's a difference in terms of how the artists themselves and the critics think about their own identity, because this is a period when we see important changes taking place in the larger climate of ideas and understandings. So, I mean, for example, we begin to have a much clearer idea of what happened during the Holocaust. And the language surrounding the Holocaust becomes more clearly defined, I think, in the minds of the Jewish community. Then there's also the creation of the State of Israel. And so we see some of the leading critics, I'm thinking of Clement Greenberg in particular, who goes, I think, from one place to another. Although in the middle of it, and I think it's interestingly in the pages of commentary, where he's arguing against what he describes as Jewish chauvinism. He's fearful that people are going to become, that the Jews are going to become so involved in a kind of Jewish nationalism and Jewish pride and so forth that ultimately it's going to be dangerous and counterproductive. He's arguing against that. And then it shows up also in his own work, I mean, his own writings. And in some ways, I think we see the same trajectory in Ben Shahn, where I think that he is probably more opposed at an earlier point in his career than he is at the very end of his career in that kind of identity. And it may have something to do with all of these other changes that are going on in American society.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hear what you're saying about the rise of other kinds of questions of identity, particularly politically oriented art, and the rise of feminism,
Right.
the Guerrilla Girls, and
Yeah, the Guerrilla Girls, right.
Yeah.
Who were, many of them were Jewish, right?
Right, right.
Okay, so I was also thinking as a historian about one of the exhibits that is not this kind of abstract avant-garde art at the Jewish Museum in what is it? I think it's also around 64, around the same time as Fiddler on the Roof, the exhibit Portal to America, which was a really popular exhibit. It was an historical exhibit about the Lower East Side and about New York City, and included some very new techniques when we think about it in terms of historical exhibits, right? The blow-ups of the photographs, and these are, for the most part, ordinary photographs from the streets of the city, the use of newspapers, of sound. It was a noisy exhibit, as I recall. It was very, very popular. So, I mean, here is a very different kind of innovation that's taking place at the Jewish Museum in the sphere of historical exhibits. As you know, what was behind doing that? And Schoner, of course, was a radical. But yeah.
Well, I think that he represented a particular point of view that connected in a curious way with some people in the Jewish community who felt that the museum's emphasis on displaying Jewish ceremonial objects in similar kinds, or let's say Jewish folk arts and so forth, that should be emphasized more strongly. And he makes a real case for that in his internal role in the museum. So I think in some ways, for him and maybe for people who shared his views, there was a continuum between focusing on these readily identifiable Jewish objects on the one hand, and then I think extending that out towards the kind of an exhibit that he does with the Portal to America. Interestingly then, his career at the Jewish Museum is rather short-lived, and he goes on to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he's commissioned to do what becomes Harlem on My Mind. It's the same person. And it's a similar exhibition in many respects. And whereas Portals to America was a very popular exhibition and didn't cause much in the way of controversy, although the Jewish Museum wasn't really identified as an art museum, Harlem on My Mind becomes a hugely controversial exhibit. I think it's still debated to this day, maybe partially about the subject matter, but certainly because here's this exhibition which is largely ethnological and documentary, but it's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It doesn't feel like art, and therefore it ought not to be there. But it was the same person, and he was bringing that same kind of, you're right, he was a sort of radical in terms of his sense of what an exhibition might be.
And of course, that exhibit, from the Jewish point of view, had that outrageous statement in the catalog of an anti-Semitic statement that was included as part of the oral testimony and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Which also led to real controversy. Right? And obviously, Schoner was not attuned to how that might have reverberated in the sort of charged atmosphere of the mid-60s.
Yeah, and another thing that's going on right at about the same time is that the Jewish Museum is being called upon, and I don't think it ever really fulfilled this role, but it was being called upon to provide advice and support for congregations that were building new synagogues. And there were discussions about whether or not the museum should have a resource center on the history of Jewish synagogue architecture, on the craftsmanship of Jewish ceremonial objects. There was a workshop for a while in the basement of the museum where people were taught to make ceremonial objects or to understand the meaning and potential design applications for ceremonial objects and so forth, but it never was really fully realized. And of course, at the same time that that's going on, they're doing exhibitions of Robert Rauschenberg's work. So you can imagine a group of congregants coming from Connecticut or White Plains or Great Neck or whatever. They were coming into the city and visiting the museum to look at the ceremonial objects, but the first thing they see is an exhibition of Robert Rauschenberg, and they're getting this pretty mixed message about what Jewish visual culture might be and how it might speak to this new synagogue that they want to build for themselves.
I think that the sort of cross-pollination that you're describing there, or the conflicting goals that around the Jewish Museum, in part also has an historical dimension, as the museum starts to pay attention to older periods in time and to play a role to bring back to American consciousness sort of the culture of Jews in other time periods, and that they start to do that as well after Portal to America. So there is a kind of effort to expand the notion of what constitutes a Jewish visual culture from the contemporary American, we're part of and shaping an American art world, to, well, we can bring into dialogue with that these older expressive forms of Jewish culture, 19th century, but even going further back, and then beginning to mix in some of the folkloric pieces of that, different appreciations.
When all of this begins to wind down, as we're getting into the later 1960s and the early 1970s, it seems to me that the grounds of the debate, at least within the Jewish community, about its own priorities and its vision for itself begins to change. And I see part of that as a kind of rising, well, let me pose a question for you. It seems to me that there's a sort of cycle of prosperity and then retrenchment that happens with that terrible recession and inflation that we get in the 1970s, which clearly affected the seminary and the museum, caused people to just stop and take stock. And I always wonder, when those moments happen in social and economic terms, whether it's just because of that we end up having a kind of rethinking, or whether maybe the time is just right. We've reached a certain point where it's time to reassess where we've been and where we're going.
So I think you're right to point to the changing socioeconomic situation of New York City in the 70s. I mean, the Jewish Theological Seminary actually debated moving out of the city at that time. And then decided not to, but where it was located on the Upper West Side, a little north of Columbia, really on the edge of Harlem, was seen as an unattractive and undesirable place. The city itself was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The kind of prosperity that had existed in the late 40s and 50s that helped to fuel this exhibit program of the museum and made it so prosperous has now indeed disappeared. So I think that does have an impact. I would add to that there arise sort of a younger generation of artists who do make, say they're making Jewish art. Some of it's inflected through feminism. Some of it is inflected through an interest in new forms of Jewish religious expression. And that really hadn't existed so much in the previous decades. So the way of thinking about what Jewish visual culture is and what the role of a Jewish museum should be, starts to shift, I think, away from the American side of it, sort of shaping the American art world and art culture, more toward the Jewish piece of it. And I think that combined with some of the other things we've talked about, suburbanization, the problems in the city itself, helps to stimulate a rethinking of the role of the museum. I mean, Joan Rosenbaum comes in, right? When does she arrive?
I think she comes around 1979, 1980.
Yeah. And she has a very important role in taking the museum in a different path. They create this new permanent exhibit on one floor, et cetera. Right?
Yeah, that was a fascinating turn. As you mentioned, the Theological Seminary itself was thinking about moving. They gave very serious thought to closing down the Jewish Museum altogether because they felt they just simply couldn't afford it. And at one point, there's this very poignant memo, actually, that's written by Louis Finkelstein to one of the donors and leaders of the museum, noting that the support of the museum's leadership was not what it might be. And he said, you know, I have rabbis who are training here. I have members of my staff who haven't had a pay increase for 2 or 3 years. They can hardly afford to send their kids to school. And yes, they're going to ask questions, why are we putting $200,000 or $300,000 a year towards the museum when, after all, our main job is to train rabbis? So there are those sorts of, this is a bad analogy, but come to Jesus moments, where you know, one really has to, you know, figure out, is this going to be a priority of ours or not? And then there's a kind of another interesting change that takes place that has to do with professionalization. Mm-hmm. Because the museum had decided to seek accreditation from the American Association of Museums. So in the midst of this economic crisis, and I think also one always has to be careful because, as I was saying before, it's hard to say which comes first. Does the economic crisis precipitate this kind of soul-searching? Or, in fact, were all of the elements in place for that sort of soul-searching, and the economic crisis just triggers a full-blown attempt to address it? But in any case, the museum applies for accreditation from the American Association of Museums, which is this national accrediting organization that serves as a kind of certification by which museums judge each other's credibility in terms of borrowing objects, circulating exhibitions, just the kinds of exchanges that museums have among each other all the time. They do an accreditation application, and it's turned down. It's a pretty good application, but it's turned down, and in part it's because of questions of fiscal instability, and partly it's because of confusion about the proper relationship between the seminary and the museum. Lines of authority, who ultimately is responsible for certain kinds of decisions, and what the American Association of Museums as a professional association is arguing for is more autonomy on the part of the museum, but by the same token, they have to become fiscally sound. And the seminary and the museum work out that relationship, and the museum does become more autonomous. And it's right about that time that Jen Rosenbaum comes in. But you're right, she really does, in some ways, professionalize the museum and really change its course.
Yeah, she brings in other interests, right? I mean, she brings in film and other elements of popular culture as well as folk cultural dimensions and stuff.
Yeah, and it becomes possible, and I think this is maybe something that you're speaking to before. It seems as though the vocabulary changes about whether or how an exhibition that might include avant-garde art or non-Jewish art might be shown under the auspices of the Jewish Museum and make it work. Mm-hmm. And there was a good recent example in 2008 of a show called Action Abstraction, which was an exhibition of work by Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, neither of whom were Jewish, I should say, and of course it's abstract expressionist art at its greatest moment. But the framework for the exhibition was the critical response as defined by Harold Rosenberg, who was the person who came up with the expression action painting, and Clement Greenberg, who talked about abstraction. And abstraction is a kind of a materiality in painting in which the form really becomes the content of art. And so by foregrounding these two Jewish critics and this debate that they had, in some ways over issues that that had nothing to do with the Jewish community, but foregrounding those two critics, it really becomes a kind of safe area in which one can present this work in that debate, even though actually it had relatively little to do with, and that's in a very narrow sense, Jewish life in New York at that time.
That's right. And that is not something they would have done back in the late 50s. They would have felt no need to try to give it an explicitly Jewish dimension. It was sort of understood that Jews were doing, and interested in cutting edge, abstract art, and that this was sort of part of the New York art world, and Jews were part of the New York art world, and so, you didn't need to make explicit a Jewish dimension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good observation.
So I think that we should open the floor to some questions, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
In my travels around the country, I've noticed that there are other museums, particularly in the model of the cultural artifacts that came at the origin at JTS, at the Jewish Museum, that, for example, at the Magnus Museum in Berkeley, the Museum of Judaica in Miami Beach, and also a small extent in some cases, the Museum of Jewish History, which has a somewhat different theme in Philadelphia, the Spertus in Chicago. To what extent would you say that the Jewish Museum has sort of provided the matrix, a template for these other institutions, particularly in their permanent exhibitions that deal with the basic artifacts of Jewish life?
Well, today it does provide a model that it didn't in the beginning. There was, when the museum was founded in 1947, there was quite a debate about what the mission of the museum should be, and it was reflected in a whole series of names that they considered, from the American Jewish Museum to the American Museum, the Jewish Museum of Art, the Jewish Art Museum, the Jewish Museum of Art and Culture. I mean, there was every possible permutation you can think of. But clearly at the center of that debate was the extent to which art should be emphasized and the objects that they were showing as works of art, or whether the emphasis should be on the objects as being exemplary of Jewish life and culture. And at the heart of that was, I think, something that you observed right at the beginning of your question. You know, do we view these objects as in some ways ethnological, kind of like the tribal artifacts that one might see in a natural history museum? And it's a very interesting question, and in fact, I think one that, for the most part, really remains unresolved in Jewish scholarship about the history of Jewish visual culture. I think we leaped too quickly to the notion that these might be viewed as art, when in fact I think at the time when the objects found their way, when the first objects were given that became the core of the Jewish Museum collection, I don't think any of the people who were giving or safeguarding those objects thought of them as artworks. As a side note, by the way, one of the founders of what became the Jewish Theological Seminary that we know today was a gentleman by the name of Cyrus Adler, who at that time was the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and was responsible for displays of Jewish artifacts, most notably at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And that display was, I think, you could call an ethnological display. And people have talked a little bit about why he wasn't more sympathetic to the creation of the Jewish Museum's more enlarged entity when it was still on the Upper West Side, and to make it more of an art museum. And I think those folks have completely overlooked the fact that he just didn't regard them as art objects. So I think you've touched on a very interesting question.
Hi. Well, such an interesting discussion. Going back to a little bit of the beginning, where thinking about the whether the museum was going to show how the artist might have felt about the museum. There wasn't any touching on the developments in architecture and the international style and the rejection maybe of Mussolini's classicism that would be a theme in internationalizing art and rejecting any kind of return to classic among artists. And also Americans very involved in bringing over contemporary artists, like contemporary at that time, like Max Ernst and Jimmy Ernst, and the role of people like Peggy Guggenheim, and so and then when you touched on the appeal of abstraction versus representational work, I think that's so interestingly explored in James Young's book, The Texture of Memory, about monumental art and commemorational art, and argued on both sides of it, whether it can be, what Deborah called abstract but expressive, or exactly what you used. But I also wanted to mention two things in the 70s. There was a show called The Plastic Presence at the Jewish Museum that included Eva Hesse, and we haven't talked about any women artists except for Deborah's mention of feminist artists and how that was changing the conversation. But this was a show about material, in a sense, and yet it included some really, for that time, radical art. And isn't it so that one of the things that might have derailed the attention to contemporary art, that there was a very controversial show with a game that was considered very anti-Semitic, made by a Jewish artist who defended it, something about rats in a maze and some connection to, it seems to me there was a very controversial,
Mirror Evil?
maybe it was very controversial. It attempted to do with Jewish themes, but it was by contemporary artists, maybe even Serrano and Piss Christ and stuff like that. But it seemed to me that the NEA and the controversies and censorship and so on may have been as much derailing to the project of Jewish art in the museum.
Let's both talk about this a little bit. So you raised some interesting questions. You're right about some exhibitions that continued to happen at the Jewish Museum through the 1970s. And in fact, there was another one called Software, which was about all kinds of electronic media. And so, indeed, I mean, when I think about that avant-garde exhibition period, I think I need to remind myself that one needs to be careful about this language, because there were these really cutting-edge exhibitions that continued to take place really up until about 1980, where things begin to end. And I think for many of the reasons that we're talking about, and perhaps some more. The last exhibition that you're referring to was part of a show called Too Jewish that was mounted by Norman Klebat, and that was just a few years ago. I think maybe 2006, 2005.
No, the Too Jewish show was.
Was that more recent?
No, it was later. It was in the late 90s, I believe, wasn't
Oh,
it?
maybe it's even earlier. Okay, I don't remember exactly.
96, 97, something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, with the Legos and the, I know what show what you mean, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
But also the culture wars, something they've done in some of their projects in a way that seemed intolerable, maybe especially to the Jewish community. But it's been, Yeshiva University right now is about to mount a show called Jewish Women Comics.
Right, which is a very, that's right, which is very cutting edge. And so Yeshiva University has, yeah, it's interesting.
Contemporary started with a show called Genesis on the Jewish theme, but it's also showing very, showed the work of Gertrude Stein about Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, which got very criticized because they themselves were not Jewish enough, or in some ways that they were,
Yeah.
Gertrude Stein.
Yeah, yeah, I think I would draw a distinction, between exhibitions which might be controversial, but still in Jewish in content, and in fact may be controversial because of the Jewish content, and exhibitions which are controversial because it's in a Jewish museum, but there's no Jewish content at all. So that I think would be the difference, actually.
I think you're right that the Jewish Museum has continued, and some of the other museums as well, to mount controversial kinds of shows. They've mounted a controversial one also about Israel, and a politicized show. But some of the controversies in the last couple of decades have had to do more with political kinds of issues than with just artistic ones, unless you want to argue that these abstract expressionist shows were politicized, which is, as I said, that there is that argument about the sort of the Cold War element of it, which I don't particularly buy, but it's out there. The museum takes a while before they start showing women. They're not in the 50s and much of the 60s. It's not really till the 70s, and it is the impact of feminism that leads them to start to show women again in there. So.
I have a question about the relationship between the seminary and the museum. And in particular, well, you can clarify, who was determining the policy of the museum in the 1950s when it began showing abstract expressionist art? Was this driven by whoever the director was at the time? And then when Louis Finkelstein stops being chancellor, I think Gershon Cohn takes over. I'm not sure when that is. Does that make any difference in their policy?
Well, to answer your last question first, I don't think the change in chancellors changes the policy that much. When the museum was created in the Warburg Mansion, starting in 1947, the relationship between the seminary and the museum, which everyone thought would remain fairly close and intimate, began to break down almost immediately for reasons which in retrospect are quite obvious, and it's just geography. They're on the opposite sides of Manhattan, and it's not very easy or quick to get from 123rd Street and Broadway over to 92nd Street and 5th. And so as a consequence, just because of that space, there begins to be a kind of separation in terms of a kind of active ongoing communication about the program of the museum. So it's a very practical problem, which the head librarian who had been overseeing the museum at that time, a very prominent scholar by the name of Alexander Marx, foresaw. He foresaw it. I think under Finkelstein, people might assume that he did not have much of a hand in the exhibition program, the avant-garde program, and was not interested in it, and as a rabbi, unsympathetic. And I would say the first two are true. I think he was busy with lots of other things. He had so many projects going on, a variety of ecumenical projects and other kinds of activities in terms of his leadership of the conservative movement. In the seminary, just the day-to-day operations of operating a large and active school, on the one hand, and then just that distance. But his correspondence with people who are criticizing the exhibition program is quite perceptive and understanding. He surprised me at a few moments of saying, well, but this is part of our community, and these people are part of our community, and there's something here to think about. So clearly he didn't have a close hand in it, or did his subordinates. Because of that separation, the museum kind of ran on its own. And then the only time they really paid close attention is when there were money problems. And somebody up on 123rd and Broadway had to write a big check, much bigger than any of them expected they were going to have to write at the end of the year. Then people started paying very close attention.
The Gershon Cohn becomes chancellor in the early 70s, and I don't think, I agree with you, I don't think that has a particular impact. I mean, the Jewish Museum may not be as high a priority in Cohen's goals, but Cohen is someone who sees who understands conservative Judaism, understands the seminary as deeply engaged with many aspects of American culture. And visual culture would have been part of it. It's just not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily his priority. I mean, his priority was to create one of his priorities was to create a graduate school of excellence at the seminary at that time. He didn't want to be on the cover of Time magazine, right? He didn't see himself as a leader of America of America's religious world.
But don't you think, I've come to feel that by referring to JTS as a seminary and sort of pigeonholing it as a rabbinic seminary, that we sort of missed the fact that I think Solomon Schechter and Cyrus Adler and Louis Finkelstein also really thought of it as a much bigger kind of institution, that it wasn't just a seminary.
Absolutely.
And in that sense, the museum had potentially a very vital role to play, but I don't know, I can't be very articulate about it because I don't feel I understand that very well, but it just seems to me that the ambitions of the seminary, probably all the way up through the 1980s at least, was in many respects grand in terms of the sort of intellectual impact on American Jewish life.
Absolutely. No, I would agree. It is a vision of the seminary as sort of producing American Jewish culture in its many iterations, whether it has to do with training rabbis or producing teachers or, you know, developing scholars or nourishing a new generation of young leaders, teenagers, or and the art, the visual culture is definitely part of that. It's a very broad vision, and
I would say also nurturing just this a large public discourse as well.
Yes, yes, because I think that the seminary saw itself as the most American of the Jewish movements. It was not a narrow denominational view. It really imagined itself as you know, expressing the best of Judaism understood very broadly in the American scene. And it's among the reasons why the seminary set out a branch in Los Angeles, and why they started, as you mentioned, the radio programs, the television, all of these things that were to speak to the larger American society. And indeed, this was, the museum was part of that. It was a way of saying, gee, Jews are engaged with, you know, the latest artistic currents, just as we're engaged with the latest intellectual currents and the latest, you know, creative writing and literature and stuff like that. So, yeah, no, I would agree.
I wanted to thank you for this really fascinating talk and the discourse that you open up about this museum that I happen to not know much about before your talk. But by thinking about the particularity of this Jewish museum and the knowledge it produced, I was very struck by the that there are two museum genres at play, and maybe even more. And you touched on the history museum and the art museum, and the very interesting ways in which these two museums intersect in the Jewish museum. And I was also struck by the so if we think about temporality with regard to these two genres. What my intuition is, like by listening to you, and my question is, is there something to that intuition? Is that so? Where does futurity lie? So how does this museum in particular produces a vision of the future, and that might have been linked more to the art museum, and then the history museum comes in, and then these two have a very interesting dialogue that brings into play, all three temporalities: the past, the present, and the future. And I mean, the avant-garde links up to the futurity of it, and I was very glad to hear that actually that discourse didn't stop, with exhibits on software or on plastic matters. That sort of discourse continued throughout the decades.
I think it's a wonderful observation.
Yeah.
Particularly that, as you put it, that notion of futurity. I mean, in very specific terms, the museum leaders did think of the museum as serving the Jewish community, but on a kind of mundane level, if you will, in terms of providing advice for synagogue design or the creation of commissioned works for museums, whether it was ceremonial objects or other things. your observation about this larger role that it might play in terms of envisioning a future Jewish community or enacting, which may be a better way of putting it, enacting a kind of future Jewish community is really interesting, and I like it a lot.
So one of the areas, a third area that has come in, has been this sort of ethnographic. It was there a bit in the beginning. It reappears in, I remember an exhibit on fabrics that they had, where they look at Jewish fabrics and the uses of these. There have been a couple of other sort of explicitly ethnographic ones. I think in part the museum has come to argue for its role in the future piece, not from anything that is actually displayed there, but from the programs that it runs. It has argued that it is a space which is open, as it once was through the art, for Jews and non-Jews, a space to mingle without any kind of checks at the door to see, whether you're sufficiently religious or not religious, as it were. It's become a place they do a lot of programming now around families to try to encourage art and a sort of kind of Jewish cultural literacy to become part of what it purveys. So it has started to articulate this as a piece of its mission, that it is a genuinely different Jewish kind of space than a synagogue space or a Jewish community center or other things that have Jewish in their title. Much more open, much more welcoming, and what it offers is this kind of cultural literacy. Now, whether this will stay part of its sense of the future, I don't know, because there are going to be arguments as to what are the components of the cultural literacy that it's purveying.
I have a question about the simultaneous collecting that's happening at the Seminary of Art through the rare book room and the library that's at the same time accumulating illuminated manuscripts and rare books and various kinds of illustrated Haggadot that are being retained sort of in a space that's directed, I think, more at scholars maybe than at sort of the general consuming public. So I'm wondering what kind of conversations are happening about where the proper place of display is for various kinds of objects like manuscripts or books, and like if this is happening not only against a conversation about the professionalization of the Jewish Museum as a museum, but also the professionalization of Jewish studies and the entrance of scholars into universities and sort of its legitimation as a discipline.
You want to answer that?
Well, you're touching a subject which in some ways has a long historical lineage on the one hand, but is very much in the moment in another. So maybe I'll talk about the background and then and Deborah will bring it up to the present. I think in the minds of people who collected luxury manuscripts and beautifully illuminated books and so forth, also in the late 19th and beginning of the 20th century gravitated towards beautiful religious ceremonial objects. And that's how the beginnings of the Jewish Museum began in 1904. There was a prominent collector in Philadelphia who donated what became the bulk of the beginning of the seminary's library and manuscript collections. Along with him, he donated a handful of objects, which he referred to as a suggestion towards a museum. And in the early days, those objects were displayed in cases in the reading room of the library. And even after a museum room was created in the seminary in 1931, there would be exhibitions of luxury manuscripts, printed pages from Bibles that had been disassembled and so forth, alongside Jewish ceremonial objects. So they occupied the same space. It doesn't quite speak to another question that may be lying behind your question, which was how, let's say, in the first half of the, the end of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century, how these kinds of collections functioned in universities or schools of higher learning. Because in different disciplines, these objects would be part of the teaching program. There was a notion of object teaching in America at the end of the 19th century, which is part of a sort of larger pedagogical schema for the whole country. There was that. But then there were sort of highly specialized collections that would exist, as there are here at the University of Michigan, that were created, let's say, to teach botany or archaeology or botany. You'd have these collections that were really part of the teaching program. Now, with the advent of digital media and other kinds of resources and so forth, those teaching collections don't necessarily have the kind of vitality they once did, but they were part of a teaching collection. At the seminary, it never, near as I can tell, functioned that way. I mean, they were there, they were interesting, people looked at them, but they weren't really, I don't think, in any vital sense, a part of the rabbinic teaching program. However, there is another kind of convergence going on.
Well, I mean, part of what has developed in the last couple of decades has been the growth of Jewish museums more generally in the United States, so that professionalization has begun to occur elsewhere, and therefore training in museum studies with a specific interest in Jewish museums. The Jewish Theological Seminary now does train in this area. The manuscripts and the other library or archival material housed there really is connected to a different way of thinking about these materials. These are very much understood as historical, as part of Jewish religious culture, and that Jewish religious culture has a visual dimension is sort of the newer piece of where scholarship has come with that. So it's relatively rare to ever see any of those objects migrate from on 23rd Street down to the Jewish Museum. They live in different worlds, and they attract different circles of scholars. Every so often, the museum will show, something that is explicitly medieval, but by and large, not. And it's interesting that they've now gone on to different kinds of trajectories. So even though the museum has a historical dimension to it, it doesn't include these illustrated manuscripts and what you call the luxury
manuscripts.
Luxury manuscripts, yeah.
The decorated ones,
The decorated.
as opposed to just the text.
Yeah.
I think that,
Although they do sell cheaper versions of things like that in the books in their shop, right? I mean, they sell. You want an elegant Seder plate, and they sell versions of that.
On reflection, I mean, one other thing that we might say is that the profession of librarianship was really well established by the beginning of the 20th century, and museum studies wasn't. The American Association of Museums was created, I think, in 1903 or 1906. It's right about then. But we really don't begin to see the professionalization of museum work begin to happen until, I would say, 2 or 3 decades later. And really, it begins, just in general in America, it really just begins to hit its stride, I would say, after the Second World War. So that notion of a professionalization of museum work per se is something that's much later than what happens in librarianship. And we need to appreciate that disciplines have a way of defining how we think about things. In fact, that was one of the reasons I was so drawn to wanting to talk with Deborah, because as a historian, and particularly a historian whose work is grounded in, I would say, a generous use of empirical sociology and other kinds of tools that sort of broaden the foundation upon which one might build a historical study, really drew me to Deborah's work because it's so different than my orientation. I was really interested in having this conversation. One might say that those kinds of differences also separate the world of studies of objects and texts. And much of the research that I'm doing in the book on the Jewish Museum is in the rare book collection, or the special collections room at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it's wonderful to be there. I'm looking at these dusty, dirty, crumbling manuscripts, but there are people who are looking at beautiful, rare books and incunabula and, you know, these wonderful things. They're all still at JTS. So a more direct answer might be that when the museum was created, there was a very conscious decision that all the books and manuscripts would stay at the seminary library, all the objects would go to the museum. And in some ways, it was almost arbitrary. And now, I think with a broader appreciation of how one might think about the breadth of Jewish material culture and the inter-animations, really, of the creation of Jewish ceremonial objects and sacred texts and the iconography that might be used in both worlds, to create that kind of division is tragic and arbitrary. And it's really through scholars like Vivian Mann who created the program at the Jewish Theological Seminary. There's some hope of creating a place where that dialogue can be engendered, despite these disciplinary boundaries.
So I have a question going back to the tension between, well, the tension regarding the role of the museum and the tension between this sort of cultural versus art and historical/ethnographic versus avant-garde, modern kind of thing. It would seem to me that that kind of tension probably occurred for any kind of museum that focuses on a specific cultural group or minority group, let's say. For example, you mentioned the Women's Museum or the African American Museum or the Museum for the Native Americans. I just wonder how these other groups have addressed that tension, or whether you could comment on even the pioneering role, if any, that the Jewish Museum might have played in this.
Well, I can't speak too much about the other museums, but I would say that the Jewish Museum was really unusual because of the way in which, in the 50s and 60s, it took sort of New York writ large as its artistic world, and felt that New York itself was sufficiently Jewish, just like that man you quoted who said, well, I like this, and I'm Jewish, right? And it was like New York was sufficiently Jewish for them to say, this artwork produced here deserves to be displayed there. I don't know whether, and I think you're right, these issues do face other museums, whether there has been a point in time with some of these other museums where they say, you know, San Francisco art is art, and it's, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's done by someone who's of one ethnic group or another. This is our city, and you know, we influence and shape so much of its culture that we're you know, we make a difference, and therefore we should show the stuff. I'm not sure whether that works, but I think that was what was happening in the 50s and 60s in New York. Just the feeling like, you know, yeah, this is a very Jewish city. So the art is, you know, belongs in a Jewish museum because it's produced here. It grows out of those interesting art worlds that emerge.
You know, that notion of representing minority cultures or ethnological or tribal cultures or others in museums, you know, this is something that it has a very long history in the history of museums, but it begins, I think people become more conscious of it, I would say, towards the end of the 19th century when both in Europe and America, our natural history museums begin to grow by leaps and bounds, and because of colonial, you know, various kinds of colonial activities and so forth, museums begin to gather these very substantial collections of tribal artifacts and other kinds of artifacts for various cultures. And so you have these Western institutions providing representations of, you know, it could be tribal culture from sub-Saharan Africa or the South Pacific or whatever, and it's done through artifacts, and they're telling these narratives of these various groups through the objects. It's not the group itself that's speaking, right? We have to be clear about that. It's this group of scholars who are using these objects to tell a story, which may or may not have some resemblance to a reality, but that's what's happening. So if we fast forward to what happens with the Jewish Museum, I hesitate to make any broad claims, but I think it's probably among the very earliest, certainly in America, one of the very earliest ethnic museums. And it does, in fact, because it is early, I think underscore issues that would arise later on for a variety of ethnic institutions that do come later. It's interesting, for example, for me to look at the history of the National Museum of the American Indian and the debates that surrounded its formation, and to see, and this is happening in the 1990s, to see how many of those issues that those leaders were grappling with, that in fact the leaders of the Jewish community were wrestling with almost a half a century earlier. There's another kind of issue there, which I talked about a little bit before, and I'll just come back to it because I think it has something to do with your question also, which is how objects may be thought of as inarticulate, and that the ethnological object is the object that only really has meaning when it's interpreted. And we think of objects that are in a sense created by anonymous artisans, the tribal object, where they're not fully conscious of what they're doing. It's because they're part of a living culture. They make these things, and so it's imbued with meaning, but only really we can interpret it because the people who made the objects were not capable of articulating it. And let's say the way a contemporary artist who writes an artist statement or does an interview might, right? So, and there are Jewish objects like that. They are ethnological, and one could talk about them in ethnological terms. And I think that's an aspect of the history of objects in Judaism that's gotten short-circuited. And I think there's an argument to be made to trying to get back to that point in a certain respect, because I think it would help to understand the visual culture of Jewish history richly and more deeply than it is. Because so many of the conversations, I'll just, one brief statement, so many of the conversations about Jewish ceremonial objects in their history is that it's an inferior art form. But notice the use of the word art. It's an inferior art form. Now, if you took the art out of it and just talked about it as an object of intrinsic interest, you could have a whole other conversation. But it gets short-circuited. And one sees that already in the formation of the Jewish Museum. They just they don't quite know what to do with that stuff.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't expand just a little bit about what the discussion led to just previously, and I was glad that it touched upon this as the blurring of the lines between libraries and museum, and the library more and more as a museum. Of course, we think of the museum as a place where objects, including books as artifacts, are put on display, and we think of the library as a place where one goes to do research, basically in two dimensions. But in actual fact, there is a certain value into doing the research in 3 dimensions. And while digitization has made it possible to do one's research from the distance, there's still some kind of intrinsic value that's lost by not actually seeing and perhaps even handling certain objects like a spice box, for example, a samim. And still there's a lingering odor in that, and you get more of an emotional sort of connection to the culture. And even things like pop-up holiday cards that were very popular at the turn of the previous century, produced in Germany particularly for American audiences. And therefore, I would want to put in a plug for the fact that the University Library, and I thank you for bringing that up here, has a Jewish heritage collection that has everything from such mundane objects as Ralph's supermarket Jewish calendars from Southern California to, in some ways, is not so mundane, but a match cover that advertised Molly Pecan and Yiddle Mitten Fiddle from 1938. Salt shakers in the form of quintessential Jewish shtetl couple from the 1939, 1940 World's Fair in New York, from what was called the Jewish Pavilion, or the Jewish Palestine Pavilion, to very rare 13th century engravings. And this forms both a research and a teaching tool here at the university, besides the fact that they were put on exhibit and sometimes go out traveling, as do exhibits from museums, to be representational, besides being research objects. And I just thought that I would not so much ask a question there, but make a comment and plug our own vast Jewish Heritage Collection, which I want to commend and thank Todd Endelman, who was largely responsible for getting this collection here from Beverly Hills, California.
We'll take one final question. Our presenters have been going at it for an hour and a half at this point.
Thank you. I hope this is a good question to end on. I wanted to ask about Jewish, objects as interpreted for their artistic impact on viewers. And one thing I noticed and was very surprised at very recently, I was in an art museum in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I don't think I had ever noticed this before. So my question is this happening? There was a whole collection in the museum that was of Jewish religious artifacts on display in a permanent gallery in a public art museum. And I don't believe I had ever seen anything like that before. So are these objects leaving Jewish museums and becoming mainstream into museums, just as, objects of, as you said, from other ethnic cultures and Christianity and whatnot that are imbued, we think, as viewers with aesthetic impact? Is this happening, or was this just unusual, or have I missed things because I haven't been to too many museums?
The only one that I recall in a major museum is at the Smithsonian, where they have a pretty substantial Judaica collection. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, in terms of the trend, of objects migrating, it's a good question. I just don't know.
There are some, in Bentonville, Arkansas, right? There are these colonial American portraits that were purchased as part of their sort of history of the United States, of art in the United States. And so these are portraits of American Jews that are now included.
Is this the Crystal Bridges?
Yeah. But they were purchased because they're viewing this art not necessarily as expressive of Jews. In fact, it's the reverse. They're viewing it more as expressive of early American culture, colonial culture. So I don't know. I haven't been to wandered into a museum in North Carolina and found this as part of the collection. So it may be that
it's in a gallery all to itself.
Really?
And it's all Judaica.
Isn't that interesting?
I could certainly picture it happening because, there are plenty of prominent Jewish collectors who collect all kinds of things, including Judaica, and who now would have entree to institutions that they did not once have entree to, and might indeed be able to persuade a major municipal museum to create a room of Judaica. So I think it's certainly feasible, but I'm not aware of it, but it's an interesting question.
Thank you very much for your report.
Thank you. Thank you. This is fun. Very interesting.